Hi, I'm Austin, and today we're looking at shocking zoo and wildlife facility tragedies. From a worker sent to inspect a submerged barrier inside the enclosure of an American crocodile, where a single mistake cost him his life, to a caretaker who had followed the same feeding routine for 3 years, before a polar bear turned an ordinary morning into his last. But first, we're heading to Oklahoma, where zookeeper Karen Hollis was killed by one of the tigers in her care. It was July 14th, 2016, and the heat across the Oklahoma plains had settled into the kind of consistency that makes the air feel stationary. Gravel roads held dust without releasing it. A small, privately operated exotic animal facility east of town had shifted its daily schedule to push feeding rotations and enclosure checks into the earliest morning hours before temperatures peaked. Karen Hollis was 34 years old. She had trained originally as a veterinary technician at a small animal clinic in Tulsa, leaving that work at 28 to pursue exotic animal care after volunteering briefly at a private cat sanctuary in East Texas. A 3-year position at a facility in the Texas Panhandle followed before she relocated to this rural Oklahoma operation 8 months prior. Among staff, she had a reputation for documentation. She filed written maintenance reports when equipment showed wear, and she had logged the service corridor's shift gate 3 separate times in the month before the incident, each report noting intermittent failure to fully latch. The reports existed. The repair had not yet been made. 8 months. That's not long enough to stop caring, and not long enough to stop believing that the system around you is going to hold. The facility housed rescued wildlife from private owners and defunct roadside exhibits, operating under a small rotating staff. Service corridors connected feeding pens to holding areas throughout the property, each fitted with heavy sliding steel barriers designed to fully isolate animal access points whenever human staff were present. The corridor connecting to the tiger holding area had been identified in those logs as requiring mechanical attention. Operations continued under adjusted procedures that depended on manual verification each time the gate was cycled. On the morning of July 14th, Karen entered the service corridor during a scheduled inspection as part of the routine zone walkthrough. A second keeper had entered the corridor with her to assist with the zone check, then briefly stepped out to retrieve equipment from an adjacent storage area. The adjusted procedure required 2-person presence during any entry near the defective gate. At the moment Karen was alone in the corridor, the gate had appeared fully latched on visual inspection. It was not. Tigers are among the largest felids on Earth. Adult males regularly exceed 400 pounds, built for explosive acceleration over short distances rather than sustained pursuit. In confined environments, they maintain behavioral patterns consistent with wild populations, territorial control of access points, and immediate, forceful responses to movement within their range. A mature tiger in a narrow service corridor has nowhere to redirect energy. In that narrow corridor, there was nowhere for the tiger to redirect its power. The space itself became the trap. Raja was the facility's resident male tiger, weighing approximately 480 pounds. He had been pacing the far section of his enclosure during the early hours before keeper movement began in adjacent zones. When the shift gate failed to seat completely, the gap was large enough for the tiger to force it further open. He pushed through and entered the service corridor. Karen was alone inside that gate. I keep coming back to it. The difference between a shift gate doing its job and everything that followed came down to a mechanism that 3 separate maintenance reports had flagged as unreliable, and that had still not been repaired. It had looked right. That morning, looking right was not the same as being right. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Raja closed the distance in a single explosive burst, 480 pounds moving at full acceleration in a space too narrow to turn. He struck Karen from behind and drove her into the corridor wall with enough force to take her off her feet. Tigers kill by targeting the neck and skull. In a confined space with nowhere for the prey to flee, the attack was immediate and decisive. The corridor gave her no room to retreat and gave the animal no reason to stop. A keeper in an adjacent section spotted the breach and radioed an emergency. Manual lockdown began immediately. Emergency recall procedures and immobilization protocols were activated, but the service corridor's narrow layout meant that by the time response personnel could reach the interior access route, the animal had already established position in the same confined space Karen occupied. The area was not cleared until emergency personnel secured the corridor from the exterior access route. Karen Hollis died in that corridor on the morning of July 14th, 2016. Investigators focused primarily on the mechanical history of the shift gate and the procedural framework that allowed operations to continue around a known failure point. The facility suspended all activity during the investigation. Findings raised questions about maintenance timelines at small private facilities, where equipment aging consistently outpaces repair schedules. The Oklahoma case was a mechanical failure. The case that follows it in coastal Queensland, Australia, was not. The gate worked. The procedure worked. What failed was the sequence, and a 180-pound reptile that had no interest in waiting for it to be corrected. It was April 22, 2014, and the Queensland coastal humidity had begun its seasonal climb, pressing into the early mornings before the sun had a chance to add to it. Along rural highways in that part of the state, small private wildlife operations started maintenance work before heat made outdoor activity difficult. Derek Paulson was 42 years old, and he had no formal zoological training. His expertise had been built entirely through hands-on experience starting in childhood, when drainage channels behind his family's property drew wild monitors and water snakes close to the house. By his mid-20s, he was cleaning enclosures at a small private reptile exhibit, and by his early 30s, he had worked himself into a specialist role through demonstrated knowledge rather than any credential. At this facility, a privately operated exotic wildlife center focused on reptile education and breeding programs, he had written several of the handling protocols himself. The owner later told investigators he was the most operationally knowledgeable person on staff, 15 years in reptile work. He had earned the authority he carried in that facility. That detail, that he wrote the protocols himself, is the one that stops me every time I read this file. He didn't just know the rules, he made them, which is part of why what the investigation found matters so much. He didn't ignore them. The center's collection included large monitor lizards, venomous snakes, and a single mature male Komodo dragon housed in a dedicated enclosure. On the morning of April 22nd, staff were performing scheduled substrate replacement and enclosure cleaning. The procedure had a required sequence. The animal was to be shifted into a secondary holding space before any keeper entered the primary enclosure. That sequence needed to be complete, and verbally confirmed complete, before the access gate was opened. A junior staff member managing the shifting procedure from the secondary holding area called over to confirm the shift was done. Investigators determined from witness accounts and entry logs that this confirmation was premature. The animal had not yet cleared the transfer point when it was called in. Derek entered on that confirmation. He acted on information that turned out to be wrong. Komodo dragons are the largest living lizard species on Earth. Mature males can exceed 6 feet in length and weigh over 150 pounds. Their jaws carry rows of serrated teeth capable of devastating lacerating wounds, and their bite delivers venom compounds that impair blood clotting and can drive the victim into shock, meaning a severe bite does not just cause trauma at the point of contact, it compromises the body's ability to stop the bleeding. The dragon had been resting near a shaded rock structure when staff movement began around the enclosure perimeter. The rock structures and substrate mounding broke clear sightlines between the entry gate and the animal's position. Derek stepped through the gate and moved 5 paces into the enclosure. The dragon came off the rockwork without warning. 185 pounds of muscle covered the distance faster than the space seemed to allow. Low to the ground, direct, with no hesitation in its approach. It seized Derek's lower leg with serrated teeth, the jaw closing with crushing force and lacerating deeply through tissue. The drag reflex followed immediately, the animal's instinct to pull prey off balance and establish ground control. Derek went down. Once a Komodo has a grip and the prey is grounded, it does not release, it works. The venom compounds in the bite began impairing blood clotting from the moment of contact, turning what would already have been severe trauma into something the body could not correct on its own. Emergency protocols were activated from outside the perimeter by staff who recognized the access sequence was out of order. The attack caused severe trauma and blood loss, and the distance to medical services from that rural coastal location meant that time was never on Derek's side once the sequence failed. Derek Paulson died from injuries sustained in that enclosure that morning. What the investigation returned was this: the dragon behaved entirely within expected parameters. The failure was procedural, a confirmation given before it was accurate, and an entry made on the strength of that confirmation. Derek followed his own protocol. What he could not account for was that the person responsible for telling him it was safe had spoken too soon. The Queensland case was about the order in which things happened. The Indian case that follows it was about distance, and about how much space a submerged animal actually needs between itself and a person standing above the waterline. It was September 3, 2017, and the backwaters of Kerala carried the end of monsoon season in the air, that particular coastal humidity that makes every surface feel slightly damp before the day has started. Tidal air moved through canal channels in the early morning, and the isolated properties along reclaimed wetlands sat quiet before the work schedule began. Vishnu Rao was 38 years old and had spent most of his working life in construction. He had grown up in Kochi, left school at 17 to work framing crews, and put in nearly 2 decades on residential and commercial sites before a fall in 2013 injured his back severely enough to end that career. He moved into facility maintenance contracting afterward. Wildlife facility work had become a consistent part of his contracts over the previous 4 years. Barrier inspections, platform repairs, structural upkeep at small private operations along the Kerala coast. He was not a trained animal handler. He held no wildlife management credentials. He was brought in for infrastructure. That had always been the arrangement. I want to stay with Vishnu for a moment before we get to what happened. At 39, a back injury ended 20 years of physical work. That's the kind of thing that forces a person to start over. He spent 4 years building a new routine, showing up every day, learning a different trade, and keeping his life moving forward. It takes a certain kind of discipline to do that, and it says something about how much trust he placed in that morning's routine. The property he was working on that morning was a privately operated lagoon facility used for guided species viewing, part of a growing niche of crocodile and reptile tourism operations that had developed along Kerala's waterway networks in the years prior. The lagoon sat on reclaimed wetland, with surface-level viewing platforms and a lower maintenance platform that sat partially below grade, enclosed on 3 sides by shallow water channels connecting to the main basin. Vishnu had been contracted to inspect and repair sections of a submerged barrier along that lower platform. He had been on the property twice before for earlier phases of the same project. Saltwater crocodiles are among the most capable ambush predators on Earth. Adult males regularly exceed 10 feet in length and can weigh over 500 pounds. They are built for motionless submersion, capable of remaining completely still beneath the surface for extended periods before initiating a strike with explosive upward force. Pressure and vibration receptors along their jaw and body allow them to detect movement above the waterline without surfacing. In shallow water adjacent to a structural edge, a submerged crocodile and a person standing on a platform above it can be separated by inches before either has moved. The lagoon's resident animal was a saltwater crocodile estimated at 11 feet in length and approximately 650 pounds. Early that morning, facility staff noted it resting submerged along a silted section of the eastern channel. Before Vishnu descended to the lower maintenance platform, a visual check of the water was performed from the surface deck. It returned nothing. No visible animal, no movement. That result was logged as a confirmed clear. What the check could not account for was the water itself. Tidal movement had stirred sediment through the lower channel, dropping visibility to near zero below the surface. The crocodile had relocated from the eastern section to a position directly adjacent to the lower platform's northern edge, submerged in approximately 18 inches of water. Through that murky, sediment-clouded surface, there was nothing to see from above. Vishnu was crouched on the lower platform, tightening a bolt on the submerged barrier, when the water came apart beneath him. The crocodile had been motionless inches away, pressure sensors reading the vibration of his tools through the structure. It surged upward with the full force of its body, 11 feet of armored muscle driving out of shallow water in a vertical strike, and seized him before he had any interval to register what was happening. The bite clamped across his torso, and the death roll began immediately, a full-body rotation designed to disorient prey, break grip, and pull the target under. In 18 inches of water adjacent to a structural channel, there was nowhere to surface. He was pulled under in the first rotation and did not come back up. Emergency retrieval procedures were activated immediately by facility staff on the surface, but the structural layout of the lower platform made rapid access from the main deck slow. Below-grade emergency extraction had not been built into the original design as a priority. Vishnu Rao died at that facility on the morning of September 3, 2017. The facility suspended all aquatic access programs while investigators reviewed the lower platform design and the protocols for confirming animal position before below-grade maintenance work was initiated. Kerala showed how an assumption about where an animal is sitting can close the distance between a person and a predator without either of them moving deliberately toward the other. The South African case moves off the water entirely, into elevated dry terrain where distance was never the problem. Visibility was, and the animal initiated contact before it was ever seen. It was May 19, 2019, and dry wind moved steadily across the Limpopo bushveld with nothing to slow it. Rock outcroppings and sparse scrub lined the slope above a small, privately run wildlife facility that had been built into the terrain to use natural windbreaks and rock formations as shade structures for large territorial cats. The dry season was already settling in. The wind didn't cool anything. It just moved the heat around. Rachel Boone was 29 years old and had spent the entirety of her professional career at this facility. She had studied animal biology at a small university in Pretoria, with her coursework focused almost entirely on predatory felids. This position had been her first after graduation, hired to manage the cheetah and several sections of the collection. Leopard care had been added to her rotation 6 months before the incident when another staff member left without being replaced. The assignment had not been requested. It had been placed on her rotation because there was no one else. On the morning of May 19th, Rachel was performing routine enclosure maintenance, repositioning feed stations and checking fencing for structural wear. The two-gate access system for the leopard enclosure was designed so that the animal's position would be visually confirmed before any keeper moved through the inner gate. A secondary gate remained partially unlatched while feed equipment was being transferred between sections. Rachel entered the inner enclosure. African leopards are among the most dangerous felids on Earth. Adult females are capable of reaching 130 pounds, with powerful, compact bodies built for explosive, close-range aggression. They are ambush predators by nature, capable of closing distance in a fraction of a second from a stationary position. That last detail is important. Most large animals give some kind of signal before they act, a change in posture, a sound, a moment that hints at what's coming. Leopards often don't. They can go from stillness to action with almost no visible warning. What made Rachel's 6 months of leopard rotation particularly difficult to draw on in that moment wasn't a lack of training. She had years of predator management experience behind her. What she didn't have was deep familiarity with this specific animal's behavior patterns in this specific terrain. And that particular enclosure, with its slope and dense vegetation, had a way of hiding what was inside it. Leopards do not telegraph. There is no postural shift, no audible warning, no moment of hesitation that a keeper can read and respond to. The female came out of the vegetation at full speed, 120 pounds of compact muscle crossing the distance before Rachel had time to track the movement. The initial strike was to the upper body, claws and weight driving her backward and off balance. What followed was the controlled application of a leopard's killing method, pinning, biting at the neck and skull, using body weight to prevent any effective resistance. The terrain grade and thick vegetation delayed emergency separation after adjacent staff activated response protocols. Rachel Boone died from her injuries on the morning of May 19, 2019. Rachel never asked for the leopard rotation. She was given it because someone left and no one was hired to replace them. The access sequencing redesign that followed the investigation, one that accounted for terrain-related blind spots created by slope and vegetation growth, could have preceded it. That framing matters to me. If this were a failure of preparation, it would land on Rachel, and it shouldn't. The decision sits above her, made where staffing gaps and workload were weighed and redistribution was chosen instead of adding support. Rachel carried the outcome of that choice, but she wasn't the one who made it. Operations were suspended while the facility reviewed the dual-gate verification procedure and redesigned enclosure access sequencing to account for terrain-related visibility obstructions. Limpopo showed how a sloped enclosure and dense vegetation can remove effective sight from an access sequence without changing a single step of the written procedure. The next case is in northern Canada, where visibility was never the issue. The failure came from something forming overnight on a lock that had been checked the afternoon before. It was November 8, 2013, on the outskirts of northern Yukon, where winter does not arrive gradually. Daylight had been contracting for weeks. Temperatures overnight had dropped well below zero, and frost had begun forming on structural components that lacked heating elements to prevent accumulation. The cold wasn't just a backdrop in this case, it was working on that lock all night. Thomas Avery was 51 years old and had spent 14 years conducting field research on Arctic mammal behavior for a small independent research organization based in Whitehorse. When that organization dissolved in 2009, Thomas moved through a series of part-time positions before taking the caretaker role at this seasonal wildlife holding facility 3 years prior. The property housed Arctic and subarctic species for research support and limited educational display during summer months. By November, visitor programs had ended, and the facility ran on reduced winter staff focused solely on animal care. Coworkers described Thomas consistently as methodical and precise, the kind of person who read equipment documentation thoroughly and kept calibration records for every tool he maintained. 14 years of field research, then an organization dissolving, followed by years of part-time roles that only partially used what he knew. zoo. Thomas Avery kept ending up overqualified for the work in front of him. The caretaker role was the closest he had come in years to something that actually fit, and there's something hard to sit with in how quickly that sense of finally being in the right place can be taken away by something so arbitrary. The facility's enclosure complex included a service tunnel connecting cold storage areas to animal access sections, designed to allow keepers to transfer feed without prolonged outdoor exposure during winter operations. The tunnel ran parallel to the polar bear enclosure, separated from it by a series of steel doors with mechanical locking systems. On the morning of November 8th, Thomas was beginning a scheduled feeding rotation that required transit through the service tunnel to retrieve stored feed from the cold unit. Polar bears are the largest land carnivores in the northern hemisphere. Adult males regularly weigh between 775 and 1,200 pounds. They are apex predators adapted for cold weather hunting, with forelimbs built for breaking through ice and restraining large prey in confined contact. A polar bear that has located a food scent source through a wall does not require visual confirmation to act on it. The wall is not a barrier to awareness, only to contact. Thomas was detectable the moment he entered that tunnel. The animal knew he was there before he knew the door hadn't held. The facility's polar bear was an adult male estimated at 900 pounds. Facility logs indicated increased movement near the service tunnel wall that morning, consistent with scent detection of the cold storage unit. The secondary door connecting the service tunnel to the enclosure section had a pre-existing locking defect, a known mechanical issue that had been logged previously. Overnight temperatures had caused ice to accumulate inside the mechanism, preventing it from fully engaging. Thomas had checked the lock the previous afternoon and confirmed it had seated. He had done everything the procedure required. What he could not check was what the temperature would do to the mechanism in the hours after his last inspection. Polar bears navigate primarily through scent. The moment Thomas entered the service tunnel carrying feed from the cold storage unit, the bear had located him through the wall. 900 pounds of animal, bred for ice hunting, registered the scent source and the vibration of footsteps in an adjacent corridor, and found the door already compromised. Thomas was halfway down the tunnel when he heard it, the scrape of claws on metal, heavy and deliberate, followed by the groan of the door giving way. The bear pushed through into the tunnel. In that enclosed space, 900 pounds moving with predatory intent left no viable response. Polar bears use their forelimbs to strike and pin, built for breaking through ice and controlling large prey in close contact. The first blow alone would have been incapacitating. The tunnel, which had been designed to protect keepers from the cold, had instead funneled the animal directly to him with nowhere to go in either direction. What he could not check was what the temperature would do to it between his last inspection and the next. Emergency containment was delayed by the same environmental conditions that caused the failure. Exterior access routes to the tunnel had begun freezing overnight, requiring additional time for response personnel to reach the interior sections. Thomas Avery died in that service tunnel on the morning of November 8, 2013. Every other case in this series has a procedural gap, a staffing shortcut, a gate that needed repair, a sequence that was rushed. This one is different. Thomas had 14 years of documented Arctic field experience, and he ran that facility with the kind of precision every maintenance log confirmed. The failure didn't come from inattention. It came from a mechanical defect that the environment made worse overnight after the last check was already completed. The facility implemented heated mechanical locking systems across all cold environment enclosures following the investigation. The case entered regional safety discussions on winterization protocols for Arctic animal holdings operating under reduced winter staffing. Those solutions were available before November 8th. They were implemented after it. Canada showed how environmental interference can produce the same outcome as a mechanical defect without sharing any of its causes. The final case takes place in the Mato Grosso region of Brazil, where a breeding season and a narrow maintenance corridor combined in the early months of 2018 to close off the margin that had kept routine entries uneventful for 2 years. It was February 27, 2018 in the agricultural outskirts of Mato Grosso, where late summer brings warm air and wet ground, and where vegetation on managed properties grows thick enough to press against enclosure fencing before the dry season has technically started. Small private breeding programs in that part of Brazil often operated in structures adapted incrementally from older agricultural buildings, infrastructure that followed the ambition rather than the other way around. Rodrigo Farias was 36 years old and had grown up working his family's egg production farm in rural Mato Grosso from the time he was a teenager. He spent his 20s in commercial poultry work, developing an instinct for handling large birds through daily contact rather than formal coursework. The shift to exotic animal husbandry came in his early 30s after he attended a regional agricultural conference where private breeding programs for rare species were presented as a growing niche. He had been hired at this facility 2 years before the incident, brought on explicitly because his background with large animals gave him practical handling experience that classroom training alone wouldn't provide. He held no credentials and no certification. The facility owner had considered that irrelevant. 2 weeks into the breeding season, the male hippopotamus was no longer the same animal Rodrigo had fed for 2 years. The protocols had not changed. The animal had. The breeding program maintained a hippopotamus pair, a dominant male and a female, managed in adjacent enclosures sharing a connecting maintenance corridor used for feeding rotation adjustments. Male hippopotamuses undergo a significant behavioral shift during breeding season, becoming markedly more territorial and reactive as competition for mating access intensifies. The change is observable in the animal's positioning, its vocalizations, and the speed at which aggressive behavior initiates. The breeding cycle at this facility had been active for approximately 2 weeks when the incident occurred. Hippopotamuses are among the most dangerous large mammals in captivity. Adult males regularly exceed 3,000 pounds. Despite their bulk, they are capable of explosive short-distance charges, accelerating faster than most people anticipate in confined spaces. Their jaws can open to nearly 4 feet wide, generating enormous crushing force. During active breeding season, males become acutely territorial, treating any entry into their space as a direct challenge regardless of the intruder's familiarity. The dominant male at this facility weighed approximately 3,200 pounds. He had positioned himself between the female's area at the far end of the enclosure and the maintenance corridor access gate. Investigators identified that placement as active territorial defense, consistent with the behavioral shift underway for the previous 2 weeks. He was standing between the female and the gate. When Rodrigo opened that gate, he didn't enter an enclosure. He entered the animal's defense perimeter. Those are not the same space, even when they share the same physical dimensions. Rodrigo entered the maintenance corridor as part of a scheduled feeding rotation adjustment on the morning of February 27th. The narrow corridor left him no room to maneuver. The hippopotamus moved with the kind of speed that consistently surprises people who have never seen it. 3,200 pounds covering the length of a maintenance corridor in a straight charge, jaws already opening. Hippos kill by crushing. The jaw can open to nearly 4 feet wide and generates force capable of bisecting large prey. In a narrow corridor with no lateral space and no distance to build any response, the charge was over before it had effectively begun. The animal drove into him, the bite followed, and the corridor's dimensions made separation from the outside nearly impossible to achieve quickly. Rodrigo Farias died in that maintenance corridor on the morning of February 27, 2018. The investigation confirmed the animal behaved exactly as a breeding season hippopotamus is documented to behave. It did not resolve clearly whether that transition had been communicated to Rodrigo before he opened the gate. Operations were suspended while the facility reviewed breeding season restrictions and implemented requirements for 2-person access during active breeding periods in all corridor-adjacent enclosures. Those protocols were available before February 27th. They were implemented after it. That pattern, the solution arriving in the investigation and the investigation arriving after the person, runs through every case in this series, and it's worth naming as exactly that, a pattern.